Hi guys. So I just had a chance to watch the new 2018 Halloween by David Gordon Green. And for this video, I wanted to give my quick impressions of it, just sort of a rundown of how I felt about it, what I liked, what I disliked, my overall impressions. I'll save a much longer video for the spoilers and a more in-depth look at the film in terms of its Gothic themes, its use of horror and terror and the shape, the character development, its use of doubles, things like that that I normally talk about on my channel. I'll do that for another video. So, first and foremost, you're probably wondering what I thought about it. Now, I'm not a critic in the sense of someone who's paid to say what I think. I merely look at things and I watch them and I feel a certain way about them. But the way that I feel about them is usually tied up in critical analysis from an academic standpoint. No one is telling me to say any of this. I'm not sort of jumping on a bandwagon. I'm merely giving my thoughts on this movie. That being said, how did I feel about it? Well, rest assured, I'm a fan of the franchise. I liked the first Halloween by John Carpenter, and I've seen several other installments in the franchise. Halloween 2, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, Halloween 4. I skipped 5 and 6 because I heard that they're pretty bad, even though I seem to recall looking at the producer's cut of Halloween 6, the one with Paul Rudd, but I did enjoy, sequel-wise, tiny pieces of Halloween 2, though most of it I found to be sort of a subpar sort of replica of the original film. Halloween 3 I enjoy because of the music and the fact that they kind of moved away from Michael Myers, as much as I enjoy that character as a slasher sort of icon. Halloween 4 I thought was a return to form, and then after that it's just kind of largely forgettable as far as I'm concerned. I didn't really care for Halloween H2O. I never saw Halloween Resurrection. The Rob Zombie films are take it or leave it. They're really their own kind of spin on things. Much more of a horror film in terms of gore and a lot less emphasis on atmosphere and suspense. This Halloween by David Gordon Green is good. I'm not saying that it's perfect, mind you, but compared to basically every Halloween film, except for maybe Halloween 4 in spots. I really did enjoy Halloween 4 as a sequel. Maybe there were some slight missteps along the way, but by and large this is a successful exercise in terms of what it tries to do. And I will say that in certain ways it takes risks, because it emulates certain qualities of the original Halloween that you might not want to emulate in terms of, say, dialogue. Some of the dialogue just sort of is almost kind of B-movie, in the same sense that the original Halloween had B-movie dialogue by and large. There weren't very many scenes where I thought to myself, you know, this is some solid acting. This is some solid dialogue. It was very much a B-horror film with a good sort of understanding of suspense, framing the shot, lighting everything to generate a feeling of dread, of atmosphere, where the killer is everywhere. And in this latest film, that was one thing that I was really sort of watching to see if they really nailed that or not. And I won't say that they do it from start to finish, because they don't. But the emphasis here isn't simply Michael Myers. There's other things going on. 40 years have gone by, so Laurie Strode has had time to have a child, who in turn has had a granddaughter for Laurie. People's lives have moved on, and very little of Haddonfield seems to remember the shape. He's almost a relic out of the past. Some of this newer content I enjoyed, some of it I didn't. There were a few weak elements. In particular, I didn't really like the investigative journalists. I found them to be somewhat annoying. You don't really know anything about them. You're just kind of waiting for them to die, in the same sense that Laurie Strode's teenager friends in the original Halloween, you don't really like them. Linda was PJ Souls' character in the original Halloween. I remember being absolutely unable to stand that character. She's the character that you want to die. They're just kind of obnoxious, they're annoying, they're ditzy, they're the blonde airhead in a slasher film. What else could happen to them? You know what kind of character they are. You know what role they have. What's interesting is that when a character like that plays the role a little too well, where it almost gets not entertaining, And I thought, man, these journalists in this film, I felt like we weren't supposed to like them. I felt like they were annoying. And it's fine to have a character like that, but you don't want to devote too much screen time to them. And I'm not saying that this latest Halloween does, but there is a somewhat lengthy starter portion to the film where they get perhaps a little bit too much screen time, I think. It maybe takes about 20 minutes or so for this film to kick off. And once that happens, I think I wasn't really bored after that. Now, I'm not saying that the transition from one scene to the next is perfect, because I thought you don't really start to get to the solid suspenseful scenes until towards the end of the film. They had a bit of, say, cross-cutting, for instance, where they'd have a character walking through a house, and you know that the shape is there, but then they would cut to a different scene, and it would sort of interrupt the tension and the suspense. That's the whole point of a haunted house, is you want a character walking around from point A to point B, and you don't want to have too much cross-cutting. And they kind of make that mistake here a few times. But, that being said, these are about the only complaints that I could really find. Some of the dialogue was a little cringeworthy, and as far as I'm concerned, that was sort of a stylistic choice where they were trying to emulate the first film. In terms of the visuals, this movie looks stellar. It had a $10 million budget, give or take, and it looks absolutely phenomenal by and large because there are no digital effects, except for perhaps one shot. I'm not going to say what it is in this video, but there is one shot. Apart from that, everything is photographed lovingly, lots of excellent night photography, a lot of variety. So you have light from the moon, you have light from street lamps and mist and smoke, all of that great stuff that horror movies need to be atmospheric. It has all of that. You have headlights, but also spinning lights on the tops of prowlers or police cars. You also have those, and there's just a lot of variety in terms of how can you light a scene in a horror movie. It's not trying to emulate the original sort of director of photography that you saw in the 1978 Halloween, but there's a similar kind of approach to things where you want to make a scene look spooky. There were certain homages to the original film that I enjoyed. I can't really say any of them without spoiling it, but there are just certain shots where you can see that they had studied the look of the first film. And what I mean by that is the actual storyboards, the way that they framed the shot and the way that the action unfolds in front of the camera. You could tell that there were very specific scenes that they had that unfold from an audiovisual standpoint the exact same way. Sort of a parallel 40 years later where the same kinds of events are happening, but they're recreated. And even if a movie isn't very good, if they take the time to study the storyboards, frame the shot and light it, and have the action and the sound design and everything, there's an act of love there where you have to sort of lovingly and painstakingly recreate a scene. It's not an easy thing to do. So if you're watching something like Terminator Genesis, where they didn't have the rights to the footage of the original film, so they had to recreate these scenes from scratch. Evil Dead 2, they didn't have the rights to their own movies, so when they did that, they had to recreate everything in such a way that was a little bit looser. But anytime you have shot for shot recreations, and now where they're trying to make it identically the same, this isn't Gus Van Sant's Psycho remake. The scenes are obviously different in certain ways, but there's careful attention to detail, and this movie had that, and it wasn't so abundant that I felt like this is just a note-for-note remake, because it wasn't. It felt very different. This is 40 years later. The kids of Haddonfield are of a different sort of variety than the ones in 1978. And as far as all of that goes, I appreciated it by and large. There are certain sort of disposable elements, say the boyfriend, for instance, I felt to be largely separate from all of the horror elements. He's merely there to be sort of a dramatic foil for Laurie's granddaughter. They probably could have cut that out or shortened it, but you have to keep in mind the whole point of a lot of the action in the original 1978 film was to convey life as it would be for teenage girls, where Deborah Hill did the dialogue for the girls, where they largely talk about boys and having sex and getting into trouble and not actually being well behaved, but just being teenagers, effectively, on Halloween night, where you can kind of cut loose. This happens in a way that's sort of parallel from all of the stabbing and Michael Myers, and they're kind of swept up in that, whereas in this latest Halloween, the boyfriend is almost kind of separate from all of that. You know, he doesn't get his comeuppance. A lot of other teenagers do in this film, but he doesn't. And you could perhaps say, well, maybe they could have cut that out. And was it really necessary to have that dramatic element? Jimmy Champagne, I believe, in his review of the film, mentioned the fact that nowadays horror films like to inject dramatic elements. Well, as far as Gothic stories go, if you go back to, say, Anne Radcliffe's Gothic novels of the late 1700s, you would have a hybrid where you have a character drama that's very lengthy, injected with lots of Gothic or horror elements. And it's not really a new thing. It may be a trend that's resurfaced in, say, the post-millennium, but it's something that existed hundreds of years ago in Britain. So it's not anything new. That being said, did they have to have it in the film? I don't think it really added anything, especially in terms of the horror. If they had cut it out, I probably wouldn't have missed it. Except Laurie Strode in the original film was sexually frustrated as well, and that her character wanted to go out with Ben Tramer, but she was too shy. And in this case, the sexual frustration for Laurie's granddaughter is the fact that she has a prospective boyfriend. There's a sense of doubling where she's an honor student, just like Laurie is. She even mentions that in the film. So they could have had it, but perhaps put it more in the periphery like they did in the original film. It's a tiny little detail. It's not like it's a huge part of the film. You're talking maybe 5 or 10 minutes, tops. Well, you're kind of setting the stage. You know, with a novel of manners with Jane Austen, you're going to introduce all of the characters. Even if a lot of the characters don't have a lot of screen time, you're going to introduce all of them, even if they seem kind of pointless. Determining the point of any of these introductions to a horror film really depends what you want out of it. And if people just want Michael Myers, of course something like that is going to seem pointless. But oftentimes these films are exercises of hybridity, where you're going to have Michael Myers, but then you're going to have the girls, and you're going to have their lives. And it would seem kind of strange if you didn't have any sort of teenage drama with a teenager and a horror film about teenagers. You know, I do think they could have shortened it a bit, but all the same, it does feel somewhat necessary, because if you cut it out entirely, it's going to give the film a somewhat anorexic feel. The trick would be striking the right balance, and I think that in the original Halloween they did that. That's about the only complaints I really had. There were perhaps 1 or 2 times where, again, the cross-cutting was kind of frustrating, where it's like, come on guys, have more scenes like the one you see in the trailer where it's a nod to Halloween 2, where Michael Myers is kind of walking around in a single long cut. They actually edit it into several sort of sequences, but it's the closest thing you get to an uninterrupted single shot sequence. There were a couple of things that were in the trailer that weren't in the movie. I think perhaps they changed the ending. I won't say what happened, but it seems like there were a couple of things that didn't quite match up. But overall, I found the kills to be really creative. I liked the gore. I watched the movie with my uncle, and he was kind of comparing it to Rob Zombie's Halloween. It wasn't a note-for-note reshoot of that film, because the treatment of gore by David Gordon Green was considerably different than Rob Zombie's. Rob Zombie's was almost sort of pornographic, in the point where you just have this camera that's kind of watching and watching and watching, and the violence kind of unfolds in a way where it never seems to end in a particular sort of kill, where the body is dead, but then he starts to mutilate the corpse. And it didn't seem like Michael did that here. He was a bit more robotic, but in a good way. Not in Halloween 2, where you're just like, oh, something's off about him in a way that doesn't sort of work. Here, they absolutely nailed the shape. I completely love it. The photography was really good. The acting is a little bit hit or miss, but I sincerely believe that they were trying to emulate the original, for better or for worse. The music was excellent. I felt like the trailers didn't give everything away. There were quite a few scenes that you could say, oh, this is the scene from the trailer. You know what's going to happen. There's quite a bit more that they don't show in the trailers that I enjoyed. Even if you kind of knew what to expect, and you should know what to expect, because watching this film as a student of Gothic media, I knew what to expect. But that's not really the point. You know, people talk about these films like they're supposed to surprise you, and it's like, well, you're talking about something where you're revisiting the same space with the same kind of trauma. It's been put together with the same pieces in slightly different ways, but oftentimes it's meant to sort of draw attention to the fact that you're returning to the scene of a crime, or the implements of murder, the victims and the predators are kind of being toyed around with and reversed, and over in this kind of phantasmagorical mess. So if you're expecting some kind of surprise where everything is just new and they reinvent the wheel, that's not how horror works. The film is literally about a town that is afflicted with the curse of violence and murder over a 3-generation span. At the very least, that goes all the way back to the 1960s, all the way into the present. It spans generations. How would that be surprising? After 40 years, the legend has permeated into Haddonfield itself. There's no room for surprise, but there is room for a haunted house. These tropes that you have. And the movie makes very good use of them, especially the ending. I really enjoyed the ending a lot. And I can't really say any more than that without giving things away. So I'm sorry if I gave anything away. I tried to keep things fairly spoiler free here. But the next video, I'll go into all the details. I'll examine everything under a microscope. It's probably going to be a pretty long ass video though, because there's a lot to talk about and much of it is good, and I totally recommend this film despite the fact that it has a long checkered history. The franchise is reinvigorated with a film that seems to understand the material. Now, some people might say that it doesn't, but you're working with something that is ongoing. And when the original Halloween was made, it was already working with material that was old, used, and being repurposed in a new shape, a new form. And that's what we get here, a new shape, a new form within a franchise that was borrowing much of its material from older franchises and older media. So I didn't really see anything to complain about when I saw the fact that it was a hybrid. It was a simulacrum, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy all the way back. I didn't see that as a complaint. Some people do, but they're probably not as well versed in how far back this mode of storytelling goes. Hundreds of years, at least. You might hear people complaining about the derivative quality of this and the way that they recycle things. But that's par for the course when it comes to horror, so I wouldn't let that discourage you from seeing this. Sounds like it's doing really well in theaters, and nothing can make me happier. Horror is suddenly relevant again. And you'll notice that it kind of comes full circle. There will be sort of a dry spell where people don't want to watch horror anymore, but they'll get tired of watching superhero movies, so they want to watch something where a villain is walking around a spooky house. It comes full circle. You know, people forget, and then people have to be reminded why horror matters, why it's important, and then they'll view it as something new and fresh to the latest generation. So that's good. I'm glad. This is a good entry for that. I think if you're new to horror, this would be a good place to start. I mean, obviously I'm going to recommend the original, but I would recommend this one too. It's solid. It's very well made, and the music especially, loved every second of it. There will be moments where there's no music at all, and then suddenly the music will kick in. So the music itself is good, but the sense of musical timing is good too. Kind of like if you watch Alien with Ridley Scott, we have moments where there's no music at all. And then there will be like these audio cues where things get kind of spooky, and then there's moments of just full-blown pandemonium where things are kind of cacophonous or exciting. There's a musical sort of crescendo, but it comes out of nowhere. It's like Carpenter's really outdone himself with this one. If you like the video, leave a like or a comment in the comment section below. If you like my content, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell to be notified when I release new videos. Also, if you want to support my content, there will be a Patreon link in the description below. Thanks, guys.